This is Talking Drupal, a weekly chat about web design and development from a group of people with one thing in common. We love Drupal. This is episode 347, GitLab CI. Welcome to Talking Drupal. Today we're talking about GitLab CI with Chris Wells. Chris Wells is the chief geek at Redfin Solutions, a Drupal agency who's been working exclusively in Drupal since version 4.7. And he is beyond honored to hold his guest spot for the last time today. Chris, welcome to the show and thank you for joining us.
Absolutely. Always good to be here.
I'm John Picozzi, and today my co-host is Nick Laughlin. Nick, how's it going?
It's going well. If you are a patron, you had an extended pre-show today where we talked about some new technology we're using to test out for recording the podcast. So if you're interested in that, then check out the patron feed.
Cool. And we have some news, collaboration. Who wants to talk about collaboration?
Yeah, so I just wanted to mention this because it kind of ties into our guest from last week and our topic for this week. So I was working on a fun side personal project this weekend, and it involved some Drupal migrations. Whenever I'm writing migrations, no matter how many I've written, I always need to look at the documentation to remember, what options are available, things like that. And so Drupal, the core Drupal migrate module and the migrate plus module both have pretty well documented process plugins. And so I always Google migrate plus process plugins and then click on them. And I ran into a bug when you clicked on right now it still exists. If you click on one of the process plugins, it links directly to the GitLab, the code for that particular process plugin. And that link is broken right now. It just says there was an error accessing that. And so I reported it in the Drupal infrastructure channel, and Tim Lennon and Neil Drum kind of dug in and looked into it and found out that there was a regression on the GitLab side. But essentially, Drupal, a lot of times the documentation, rather than linking to a particular branch for something, they link to head because branches change, 9.1, 9.2, 9.3, etc. And so when you're trying to document a particular or reference a particular file, it's better just to reference head. So it's referencing the most up to date, and GitLab had a regression where it just doesn't know what to do with that on the GraphQL side. So I think they have a workaround fix that they'll be implementing in the next maintenance window, I guess. But it's just interesting to see how different different tools kind of collaborate together to find what's going on. And there's already been a solution, or the issue's already been assigned to a particular release in GitLab, so it'll be fixed kind of at its core. But it's nice to see how different communities or tools kind of work together to figure things out. And since it affects GitLab, I thought it was a good topic since it was kind of ongoing right now.
Yeah, I think that the collaboration between GitLab and the Drupal community is really solid, really great. Tim and those folks talked about that at their DrupalCon sort of panel about next steps for the association and this infrastructure. So I saw that come across this weekend in the Drupal Slack, and I thought that was pretty neat. And you heard it here first, folks. Nick does migrations in his spare time for fun, so he's definitely the guy you want to call.
It's actually I might talk about it at some point, but I was working on one of the relationships that I had to migrate in, and I was like trying to figure out how it would work. And I didn't quite realize how much data there was in the data set I'm feeding from. And I opened it up, and there's like 1.5 million rows. And I was like, that's a little bit more than I expected. That's going to take quite some time to migrate.
Sorry, did you say 1.5 million?
Yeah.
Wow, that's a lot. That's a long migration right there.
Yeah, it's probably going to take 3 or 4 hours.
Oh,
but
geez.
It's Nick's. It's every Lego piece Nick owns, and he's not doing a quantity field. It's just every piece gets its own row.
I feel like that'd be like 6 or 7 million, but maybe I'm wrong. It's interesting because I just had this like horrific vision of like getting to like hour 4.5 and then like it just failing and you having to start all over again.
I mean, the nice thing about Drupal migrations is you can kind of pick up where you need to. But it's not the largest migration I've written. I mean, uh, there was one that I wrote last year with a team that you know, John, actually, that was 1.5 million users. And I think that migration took 4 days to run. So
Hmm.
Drupal handles long running migrations fairly well.
There you go.
Thank you, command line.
All right, let's jump right into our primary topic because it's kind of a hefty one, right? So we're talking about GitLab CI, and there are a couple of things going on there, right? We got the GitLab part and the CI part. So let's break it down a little bit first for the listener, right? And Chris, could you explain to us what is CI, and then what is GitLab CI?
Okay. So we'll start with the easy one. So CI, yeah, I say that easy and shorter is I guess it. So CI stands for continuous integration, more or less, which means you're taking your code and you're integrating it into the mainline branch as sort of frequently as you can. So frequently, in fact, that it is called continuous. So whenever you're okay to push code, you can push code. And the idea with that is that you have tools in place that are letting you know that you're doing that safely, right? So, are you really allowed to be pushing this code? Does it meet our, I don't know, coding standards? Does it have tests? Did it break any previous tests that were run? So, automatically doing all of that stuff means that you have continuous integration. You can push code, you know it's safe to go, or you can trust that it's at least relatively safe to go. There's always the issue of tests that don't fully cover everything, but giving you that confidence to say I can ship this, how it is now. And so GitLab being the this it's really a monolithic tool for your version control for managing your source code, and so it has I don't want to say bolted on. It's been very intentional, but they have grown sort of organically into a lot of different areas to sort of be a complete sort of DevOps workflow kind of. So GitLab CI there's a lot of CI tools out there that help you do this kind of thing. And GitLab CI is baked right into GitLab. So if you're using GitLab for your version control, you get GitLab CI sort of out of the box, comes with it, that can help run all these tests, do all these tasks.
So how is, because you typically hear CI CD, right? How is CI, the continuous integration, different than the CD part?
Well, it's really the two sides of the same coin, and that's why they end up getting slashed together and just called CI/CD. So CD is the idea of continuous delivery. So integration simply means that my code is going into the mainline branch. But if you're on a monthly or biweekly release cycle or something, then that code doesn't actually get delivered to the customer until you do a sort of packaged release. So you can use CI tools without CD tools. CD is just sort of the delivery aspect. So if you get through your CI and all the tests pass and everything, well, hey, what if we automatically shipped it live as soon as all the tests pass and everything goes? So now you've really got CI and CD. You've got continuous integration and continuous delivery where you're shipping to production, on
And
a near
hopefully
continuous basis.
successful deployments, right?
Yeah, and the good news is if you write your CD stuff really well, then if it's trying to, if let's say you get through your CI phase, you build, you test, all that stuff works, and then the delivery actually fails, with robust enough CD, it's not going to take your production site down by trying to deliver something that failed. So
That's awesome.
Yeah.
So we're going to talk about this more specifically in a little bit, but can you just give us a little bit of an overview about how this kind of applies to Drupal?
yeah, I would love to. I had some great opportunity to talk to people on the infrastructure team at DrupalCon, and We've been working really close with them in Project Browser, which I'm the initiative lead for, if you didn't know that. And this matters to Drupal because we are making a sort of big push right now. The Drupal Association and that team is making a big push to, in a sense, get off the island. Drupal has come from a place where we've homegrown a lot of our tools from the very beginning. So we have our own issue queue. We have our own CI called Drupal CI. We have a homegrown credit and contribution credit system that, exists inside of Drupal. And a lot of that has been, made possible by the fact that we homegrew a lot of these things. But, the maintenance of that is, substantial.
Significant.
And so, yeah, we have made a push, which is the GitLab Acceleration Initiative, I think, where we're trying to replace some of these homegrown tools with an off-the-shelf product. So we're trying to move our issue queue from our homegrown issue queue to the GitLab issue queue. We've already moved our source control from our custom, Git server. I don't know what that used to run on, but all of the code that Drupal is hosting is now on GitLab and on their own self-hosted GitLab instance. So yeah, that's why it matters to us, is because the Drupal community is moving to GitLab.
You mentioned some of the benefits. What are the other benefits of using CI? I'm just thinking back to the days before these types of things really became the norm, like Travis CI, I think, and Circle CI are two of the ones that really came out in the beginning. And I'm just remembering what deployment and testing processes used to look like. How has this kind of changed the industry?
Yeah, and I mean, to a large extent, it already has. It's really crazy because I can't think of a time when CI wasn't always kind of the dream, but I can certainly remember a time when it wasn't. So, right, my first job out of college was building embedded systems down in Rhode Island, and we built a lot of medical devices, and a lot of that stuff was for level 3 medical devices, which is, right, if the software goes wrong, someone can die. It's a big deal. So there's a test plan, and every time you changed any bit of software, you had to fully run that manual test plan. And that was a huge deal because we would do something like just upload the translation files and change them from English to Italian, and have to run a 27-hour manual test suite on the device, right? And so for as long as there's been developers running tests, there have been developers who have dreamed about running tests in an automated fashion, running automated testing. So a lot of this CI came from this sort of agile manifesto, test-driven development kind of idea, where if you have tests and they're established and you can get them to run, well, hey, can we just get them to run automatically? Hey, can we actually tie this into our version control? Like this is sort of the DevOps dream, right? Of like automate all the things so that developers can just do their jobs and do their jobs confidently. So that's really the major benefit here of saying we can get faster time to market because we can offload some of this automated testing to machines to do it and bounce it back to us if there's a failure.
I mean, that's really like, no, everybody hates doing those repetitive tasks, right? And this is like a perfect use case for CI and CI testing, is to like, hey, I'm going to send my code up. You're going to do the repetitive tasks and make sure everything looks good. And if it's not, you pop an error and I fix it. And if it is, like, it moves on, I move on to the next thing, right?
Yeah. And I keep referring to testing as kind of like the brass ring here, but it's not necessarily. I mean, there's the build process. I don't want to put vendor, or node modules in my code. I want to have a lightweight repo, and I want something else to sort of do that. And so you're offloading that piece of the puzzle as well.
It also prevents your test scripts from acting upon that stuff, right? So, I mean, you can write your test scripts to ignore those directories, obviously, but like you don't need to test somebody else's code, right? Because you don't
Right.
necessarily have control over that. So, if you're looking at holistic testing, like it's gonna it's gonna act on everything that's in your repo, which could be somebody else's project, which is not necessarily the best use of its time and energy. So,
Exactly.
let's talk about some key concepts and terminology because I feel like anytime I get into CI/CD, like there are terms and I might not always be familiar with them. So can you go over some of the high level terminology and concepts around a CI process?
Yeah, and let me qualify this by saying I definitely am most well versed in GitLab CI specifically. I don't know a lot about Travis or Circle, and I think that came from Redfin being somewhat early adopters of GitLab, back in the day. So when I was getting our own, upgrading our own sort of kind of half homegrown Git server to something more well established. I said, "Oh, I've got CI/CD built in. This is the one I'm going to use. This is the one I'm going to learn." So I can talk a lot about GitLab CI. I'm sure that these concepts translate, but they might be named other things in other tools.
Mhm.
But in terms of GitLab, the overarching process that you need to understand is the idea of a pipeline. So when you push code or open a merge request, depending on how you have your CI/CD set up, it looks at your GitLab CI.yaml file. It's actually a hidden, so .gitlab-ci.yml that's in the root of your project, and it's going to run a pipeline based on what's described in that file. So the pipeline is the full process from, I've received new code to whatever tasks you want to run that are sort of done in there. And then pipelines themselves are divided into stages. And I think that by default, GitLab CI assumes 3 stages, which are called build, test, and deploy, is my guess. Um, so build would be, okay, I need to compile this source code, or I need to, you know, do a composer install, or uh, yarn install or npm install, whatever I'm doing to pull in dependencies is typically what we see in the web world. But even if this were a project that were, you know, C for embedded systems, you might compile it and get all of your compiled objects or get your compiled binary or whatever it is that you need to do. From there, you move on to the test phase. So, okay, I've built it, I've got all my dependencies, I've got something in a functional state. So now running through the uh, test stage, I might run linters, or I might run um, PHP unit tests, or I might even run headless Chrome tests with Nightwatch or Phantom or Cypress, as we talked about a few weeks back. You can run all those tests headless, and then you move into the deploy stage, which is where you might do the actual tasks of either rsyncing to your web server, or telling your web server to do a git pull, or whatever it is that you're using for your deployment strategy. Those would happen in the deploy stage. And individually within each of those stages, you can have multiple jobs. So for the build stage, I might have a job that does, a build of my React app. But I might also be pulling in composer dependencies, and those might be separate tasks that all happen in the build stage. I might have several different types of tests that run inside the uh, test stage, like code linting, code quality, test coverage. Might have PHP unit tests, which might be separate from my Nightwatch tests or end-to-end tests or whatever. So that's really how it all breaks down. The pipeline is the whole thing, start to finish. The stages are the different sort of I don't know, swim lanes of the pipeline, and then the individual jobs are sort of the tasks that you run inside each of those.
So, question on that, right? So you have the pipeline, you have the stages, you have the jobs. if I push my code, right, it starts going through a pipeline. It goes through, whatever stage one is, the first stage. It runs through a couple of jobs. It hits an error. Does it fail immediately, or is it a case where it'll go through and like try to get to the end if it can? If it can't, it'll obviously fail spectacularly. But like, is it like, hey, first error, I'm done, I'm stopping? And is that like factor into how you build your jobs?
Yeah, and that's really good point. And I think what's a big lesson in a lot of these tools is they're very flexible, which means they're very powerful, which means they can be very complicated.
Hmm.
So the answer to your question is depends how you set it up.
Okay.
You may want to allow failures of certain jobs and just have it be reported on. For example, if your PHP unit tests pass and your end-to-end tests pass, but your code linter fails, you might want to allow the linter to fail. Let's ship this, but I want someone to know that, hey, your code's, not meeting our coding standards, So you can sort of design your own things which you allow to pass or fail. Stages have to pass in order to hand things off to the next stage. So if you have a, if you have 5 jobs, let's say build runs fine, then you have 5 jobs in test and 2 are allowed to fail and one of them fails. Fine, we're going to go ahead and let this get passed into the next stage,
Hmm.
and go ahead and deploy it. But you can also say, no, I don't want to do that. If anything fails, reject it. So as I'm working on GitLab CI integration for Project Browser, I am hard failing on linter errors. I don't, we have this is not my idea. I heard this elsewhere, so I don't feel bad saying it. But, to some extent, there's like a culture of nitpicking in Drupal where people will chime in to say like, indent this 2 spaces and fix some of this stuff. And I think it's really nice that we can pass that to the CI tool and say, oh, the tests are failing. And actually the reason is because you just need to indent this and, fix some code standard issues or something. And I think it's kind of nice. So I'm hard failing on, when I eventually get this up and running, I'll be hard failing on linter errors.
Make the CI the bad guy is what you're saying.
Yeah, I think that's probably good for our community overall. Like, hey, I don't know, man. It's just CI's failing.
So that's interesting. So you can't pass stages unless there are no failures if it's built that way. Because I almost envision like a testing stage and then a build stage and then like a clean up and deploy stage where like everything gets finished, right? So like if the
Mhm.
first 2 don't pass, like then I would never want to go to the third one, but like I might want to try 1 and 2 before just like dropping it completely. But
Yeah, you bring up a good point, which is that a lot of this cleanup type stuff isn't actually necessary. And the reason for that is that between stages, the way GitLab CI works is it passes artifacts between them. So in your build stage, you might build out, you run your composer install and your yarn install, you get all your dependencies, process your CSS, you get your .css file. Now you've got like a zip ball of your completely built site, and you pass that clean zip ball into your test environment. And it uses that as sort of your starting point for the test stage. It can do whatever it wants to that code and throw it out and do whatever. And you can then use that same clean tarball to start your deploy process. So you know that you have run tests, and even though I may have spun up a database or added some files to the code base because of some particular test you were writing or whatever, you don't necessarily have to take the output of the test environment and pass that to your deploy environment. If all your tests pass, you know that your original built uh, artifact is good, and you can use that to send it off to the next route. But that's a lot of why stages are sort of dependent on each other, is because it kind of presumes, well, the tests aren't going to run or work at all if it doesn't build. So,
all right.
there's no point in going further.
So let's talk about runners. What are they and how do they work?
Yeah. So that's really the power behind the whole idea here is, okay, so I've talked about, and then magic, it runs. And the runners are actually the pieces of the puzzle that actually make this work. So runners are actually, it's a piece of software running on a server somewhere. It could be running in virtual machines. It could be running on bare metal. It could be running on your local laptop. I've got a runner that I have at a machine in the office in Portland, and I use it to help build Project Browser, and I use it to build stuff off our own GitLab CI. So what that runner does fundamentally, there's actually a number of different ways that you can set up your runners. They can be shell runners, or they can be Docker runners, or they can be Docker runners orchestrated by Kubernetes.
Okay.
So in fact, the way that the Drupal implementation works is that latter piece. So they're, as runners are needed, they're orchestrated through Kubernetes and say, oh, I need some runners, and it'll spin up some Docker containers for you to run, so that there's kind of I hesitate to say an unlimited supply, but there's, it's scaling automatically based on load, which is kind of what you want. If there's a big push in core and we need a bunch of test runners running, it'll spin those up, and then it'll sort of spin them down when there's less load.
So if I'm understanding you correctly, a runner is basically just like an environment, and it could be, a basic dev environment for testing. It could be some sort of other like environment or script that can run to do a task.
Yeah, and that's really it. The runner is the thing that does what it's told, and I'd say the 90% use case is that it's going to be Docker, right? So the runner, basically GitLab CI has this pool of runners that are out there and available. And most of the time, these are what GitLab calls shared runners, which is like, I'm a runner and I'm available to whoever needs one. And what GitLab does is it says, okay, GitLab's responsible for saying, okay, I've got this pool of 16 runners, 12 are busy, so I'm going to assign this job to this runner. So it finds one that's available, and it says, here's what you need to worry about. And typically what that is spinning up containers, or at least one container where it says, so the way we do it at Redfin is typically we have one container that is like, to some extent violates the purpose of Docker, which is it's got all the stuff in the container. It's got PHP and Node and MySQL, and it's all just built onto this one CI container. And that's what we use to build, run our composer install, or run our node install, npm install, yarn install, whatever it is that we need to do. So the runner is what sits out there in the world and is like, I think of like the SETI project or a cryptocurrency miner. It just kind of sits there, waits for work to do, and does that work in the background.
So is it processing jobs?
It actually is more at the job level than the pipeline level. So it might even be per stage, but it's definitely not per pipeline. So you don't get assigned a runner. Yeah, it is per job, I think, actually, because you can actually parallelize. So if your test has 5 different tasks in it, one to do linting, one to do PHP unit, and one to do end-to-end, those can actually all 3 be running at the same time on 3 different runners. It'll spin up the container and it'll say, okay, my job is to do the PHP unit tests, but there might be some other one out there in the world that says, hey, my job is to do this other one.
Maybe they're called like processes in GitHub or something like that. Seem to be remembering a little bit.
GitHub Actions is definitely new on the scene with this, but it has a lot of the similar concepts. But yeah, that's what's cool, is that you can use multiple runners to run these jobs simultaneously. And
so, speaking of GitHub Actions, what are some other commonly used CI tools? Because GitLab isn't unique in this. GitLab, Bitbucket, GitHub, they all have their own versions of these. Are there other tools that you've used in the past that do the same kind of thing?
Yeah, I wish I could say that I had used a ton. I will say that GitHub Actions is definitely new on the scene and is very cool, especially if you're tightly coupled to GitHub. Circle CI is definitely a big player in this game. Jenkins was sort of one of the OGs that kind of came along and pioneered this space. And Travis, I know, is another one that's super popular. Travis CI is out there. One of the things that I think is, and of course, there's Drupal CI. I don't know what nuts and bolts put that together, but that's our homegrown version of this tool inside the Drupal community. One of the things that I think is like something to evaluate when you're looking at this kind of solution is the coupling of these things together, right? So Drupal moving to GitLab, well, it's just incredibly logical to move to GitLab CI. But let's say you're not doing that at all. You're, in a different world. Maybe an external tool like Circle CI is better for you because it, integrates with a lot of different things, and it was built to be just like a CI tool at its core, as opposed to GitLab, which does a lot of things well, but does a lot of things. It's really unabashedly trying to be this sort of monolithic DevOps platform, and another thing that GitLab offers is like container registries, like your own personal Docker hub built right into GitLab. We make heavy use of this because when we build our CI containers for our project, we push them to the GitLab container registry, for example. So it does a lot of that. I think that's the benefit of GitLab CI really comes into play when you're using GitLab for all of its other things. And that's where I think where the overlap with Drupal is like, oh, well, we're going to be using GitLab issues. There's very cool things that you can do because of this tight coupling and tight integration. You can say that an MR closes an issue and it auto closes the issue, and then it runs a pipeline. And then you can say in the tool, merge this when the pipeline succeeds, and if the pipeline's going to take an hour to run, but as long as it passes, I think this works. This is a good solution. And when you don't have that tight coupling, you're relying on, bits of string and glue, aka API calls or something, to be able to do that with an external tool like Circle CI. Whereas with, everything being in GitLab, we can take advantage of that.
There's also a couple other cases I want to mention, or a couple other tools I want to mention that are pretty relevant for the Drupal community. Platform SH is a tool, a hosting platform that has kind of their own built-in deployment process, but you can also tag some CI onto that if you want to. Acquia's new Code Studio platform that we talked about a few episodes ago is built on top of GitLab as well and uses their GitLab CI. And then Pantheon has their Quicksilver.
One thing that's really interesting about Pantheon with that is that you are using your own CI more or less. So even with like Pantheon's build tools, we're using our GitLab server and our GitLab CI, and it integrates with a lot of those different pieces. And then, Quicksilver does the platform automation stuff from Pantheon. Yeah.
So the Drupal Association is obviously moving to GitLab CI now. Like we moved the repos to GitLab, and now we're starting to add GitLab CI on top of that. Can you highlight some of the benefits that the community has seen from this transition?
I am going to be not reticent, but certainly reserved. This is still very much we're at the very front end of this project of getting GitLab CI to work. So Project Browser is one of maybe a dozen projects that are in the GitLab CI alpha testers phase of trying to move away from Drupal CI and into GitLab CI. Moving to GitLab in general, I think there's a ton of really great advantages to that we've talked about that are not necessarily related to CI, issue management using modern tooling. I can't tell you the number of times that I've been in the Drupal issue queue and just said, why can't I just type Markdown into this? Like, I just want to like bold this thing, and I'm still typing HTML tags instead of asterisks. It's like, that's 14 extra keystrokes or so. Like, I don't want to do that.
Markdown and merge requests. Those are the big ones, right?
Yep. So Markdown, merge requests. But I think as we get to just a more modern tooling in general, I think we take advantage of a lot of the features that the tight coupling offers us, being able to say, merge this as long as the tests pass. We can't do that right now. We have to upload a patch file or have a merge request now and wait for the test to pass and then say, okay, this is fixed. And then, there's a lot of steps in management on there. So I think we're going to save the community a lot of time. Um, we'll have a lot less of that death by a thousand cuts type problem where the tooling is just getting out of people's way. And we can go ahead and say, this merge request closes this issue, merge it as long as the test pass, go. And you can kind of walk away and know that, powerful automation behind the scenes is going to help you achieve that. But I think where this community is really going to benefit is, I think something that Neil said is when we offload the overhead of managing these homegrown custom built tools to an off the shelf product, we've got a lot more cycles available in our, resource constrained nonprofit Drupal association to work on some of the things that are unique and special to us. We have Drupal CI to solve a CI problem, and there's an off-the-shelf product that does that as well and better, and maybe even a more supported way with a larger, support base. So that's freeing up those resources inside the association to be able to do some really cool stuff. GitLab's even,
Yeah,
I think I said at the top of the program, we're working with GitLab so closely that they're working on integrating an issue credit system into their platform.
yeah.
That's cool stuff.
And I want to call out too, one of the interesting things is, the Drupal Association and Drupal community didn't just come out and build a Drupal. They didn't like see, oh, CI is cool, let me build a Drupal CI bespoke system. It was more organic than that. There was a need in the Drupal community for something like this that had integrated testing, like just like the simple test, bot. Like there were, in many ways, the Drupal community was a trailblazer on how this did, and there weren't tools that existed at the time to solve these
Mm-hmm.
problems in the way that the Drupal community needed them solved. So Drupal CI came out of that. Now there are, like you said, off-the-shelf tools that can solve some of these problems, and so there's a lot of benefit, like you said, to moving to those off-the-shelf products. But it's also not a trivial problem. It's a complex problem because you don't want to. I think Tim had mentioned one of the big things that they're trying to be careful about is they want current tests to work. They don't
Right.
want to have force every single contrib module to then go in and rewrite the tests that they've already written to work with GitLab CI. They need to have some sort of translation mechanism.
Mm-hmm.
And we benefit even from the issue that I mentioned at the beginning of the show. If everything was still in Drupal's kind of homegrown Git uh, system, only the people in the Drupal association that work on the tech stuff would be able to debug that issue. But since there's GitLab behind it, they can get support from outside the community and find a problem that other people are experiencing as well and solve that for the wider development community. So yeah, I'm excited to see, because Drupal, time and time again, the Drupal community, Drupal association has come up with these amazing tools that have solved real problems in developing an open source project like this that's so distributed. And once those problems get solved in the wider community, moving that in, they can now move to the next problem. They can trailblaze again. And I'm excited to see once we get there what's going to come out of that. Because, like you said, Chris, things like it works both ways. Like where it's putting issue credits back into GitLab so that once that's there, other people that use GitLab can provide issue credits for things. Other projects
Absolutely.
can start utilizing that functionality.
And GitLab is
And
open source, and this is our ethos. We're
yeah,
embracing and utilizing and getting off the island and helping prop up and build up other open source projects by in a weird backhanded way of leaning on them until they do what we need. We have somewhat of a history of that with CK Editor and with some other tools, but it is definitely stuff that benefits everyone. Like the issue credit contribution system is a unique and special gem in the Drupal community. And how cool would it be to be able to translate that to other projects?
It's very much growing the island, right? So we talk about getting off the island, but as we get off of it, we also grow it because we have a new set of folks that are helping with some of the underpinning and some of the tooling that we're using.
So how does someone use GitLab CI with Drupal? I think there's kind of two main ways that we've talked about on the show. So I'd like to kind of clarify both of those. One is, using previously your project was using Drupal CI, for the contributed module. Now you're going to be using GitLab CI, once that comes in. The second thing is you have a Drupal project that you're using and you're setting up continuous integration for that Drupal project. How do you use GitLab CI with those two situations?
Yeah, really good question. I'm going to start with the second one first, because that's where I sort of came up originally with GitLab CI. Was, we're an agency, so we're building websites where we want to run automated tests. We want to get the build process in place. We want to deploy that stuff live automatically as long as everything passes. So to that end, we're, like John said earlier, we're not testing other people's code. We're testing our code. So, in our Drupal projects that are hosted on our GitLab, we have a GitLab CI YAML, which will, run through the build process, run through the test process, and run through the deploy process. And that looks like something possibly a little bit different than in the sort of community and contribution space. So we are, for example, we have lightweight repos. We commit to, we just commit the composer lock, but nothing in vendor. Right. And then we have a build step, which builds that, and we take that artifact and we pass it on to our test phase. Here, we're not so much concerned about unit testing the contrib modules we're using. We don't care. We mostly are running end-to-end tests with Cypress to say, okay, so when you click on this and you are not logged in, you get an access denied, to test that our content access setup is still working. We don't have a regression there. And as long as that suite passes, and of course you can also be running, unit tests against your custom code, but just the stuff that's really your ownership inside that project. And then we handle the deployment process as well to our production server. So we do a lot of Amazon hosting for one. And we do a lot of Pantheon hosting for two, and we use their build tools platform to deploy there. And I think what's really great that we've set up in both of those environments for either Pantheon or for our own custom Amazon stuff is we have the ability to kind of do like what Tugboat kind of does. We have a pipeline that will not a pipeline, I guess, a couple of different, I guess it is a pipeline. The tasks can be based on your branch name, for example. So if we start any branch with the word stage dash, then we'll automatically spin up an environment from the production environment on one of our staging servers. So
cool.
We can have like a per merge request review environment for our clients to look at and say, oh, yep, okay, this is good, this is working. And then when we merge that, there's another pipeline that runs only on merge request deletion, or on branch deletion, I think, that will then go clean up that stage environment for us. It'll sort of do a deploy type step where it's SSHing over to the other server, remotely executing commands over SSH to tear down the database, tear down the folder, that kind of stuff. So, in an agency environment where you're building a Drupal project, those are the kinds of things you need to think about. When you get over to the contribution side, the CD side of things kind of goes away. You're a lot more interested in just the continuous integration. Are we building and testing, and does this still continue to work?
So this might be a dumb question, so brace yourselves. I'm wondering, can you use GitLab CI with other Git solutions? Like if I'm using GitHub and I don't want to use GitHub Actions, or I have a client, so say, for example, Redfin, right, is a GitLab CI shop. You have a bunch of, pipelines and jobs written in with GitLab CI, and your client wants to use something like GitHub or Bitbucket or something like that. Can you use GitLab CI with other Git solutions?
Nothing's impossible, John. That's the motto I live by. And that's, but I wouldn't do it.
That's why we get along, because with enough time and money, you can do anything. But
yeah.
Okay, so you
Give me
wouldn't
all
do
that
it.
time and money. We're good to go. Yeah, it's not something that I would reach for. I think that if I did, I would try to make it look as if it were in GitLab to begin with, right? That's again, I think that's the advantage comes from the tight coupling.
Yep.
So that's where like I was saying before, I might reach for a more isolated tool like Circle CI if I wanted to sort of integrate this code base, but run this and then do something else over here. You could do it. You can definitely sync repos, across projects. GitLab Enterprise has bidirectional syncing of repositories.
How portable, I guess, are your GitLab CI kind of pipelines, jobs, those sorts of things?
Yeah, that's an interesting point that I've been like kind of struggling with or finding out as I've worked on this for Project Browser, which is like the underlying things are very portable. Like at the end of the day, you could have a bash script that did this, or you could have a GitLab CI YAML file that did this, or you could have a Travis CI YAML file that does it. YAML and JavaScript are eating the world. So, the way that you run your PHP unit tests, the command line that says like PHP unit -- standard is this, scan this code base for tests and execute them, like that doesn't really change. This tool is just, how do we get a machine? How do we get some kind of environment that will actually execute that command? And that's where all the runners and the GitLab CI comes in. But I do believe that a lot of the advantage of using GitLab CI comes from the fact that it's bolted right onto, if you're hosting with GitLab.
So I wanted to go back to an earlier question and clarify something too. Is this something that you think is worthwhile for a small team? What size project do you need before CI becomes worth looking into?
I would say I can answer this from the perspective of like Redfin's growth pattern over the years, and going from at our lowest kind of a 2-person shop with just Patrick and I to now being like maybe a 12-person shop. It was somewhere in the middle where we really found ourselves needing this as a tool. Just the ability to do merge requests, the ability to do code reviews. Drupal 8 and its dependency on Composer really is what I think drove us more than necessarily team size, but the real need to just like, I don't want to like commit vendor. I just don't want to do it. It makes me angry.
Yeah.
I want something to run the command and then sync that stuff up to live. Even if you have a build and a deploy stage and not a testing stage at all, that's sort of probably your first growth pattern when you're going from I'm building a simple site for my mom's book club and it's just me and I'm the only developer and I FTP it and I have my local copy and I have my production copy and I work on it locally, and then when it's all set, I FTP that stuff up to live and it, flush the cache and everything's good. Like, I don't know that there's a huge benefit there, but when we started to get anywhere past 3 people on the team, it really started to make sense. And I think it kind of dovetailed around that time with Drupal 8 and Composer and dependencies and the world of front end dependencies with Gulp and task runners and that kind of stuff. So I think those are the 2 main drivers that really do it necessarily for,
it feels
it's a little bit team size, but it's a little bit the tooling underneath as well.
For me, it feels less about team size and more about people who want to save time, right? If you're a small shop and you don't have a ton of time to kind of just like sit and do things or sit and watch builds or whatever, like this is where this kind of brick comes in for you, right? It helps you kind of automate those things so you can go on to other things, right? So yeah, I don't know for me, based on our conversation today, if it's really necessarily about team size, other than the FTP scenario with mom's what was
Yeah.
it, Tupperware
Book
website,
club or
book
something.
club.
Yeah,
Yeah,
whatever.
there you go. Um, you know, it really comes down to like, hey, if you want to automate and save time and like reduce your amount of repetitive tasks, then this is probably a
Yeah.
good workflow.
Yeah. If you get to that point where you're like, boy, I wish a computer could do this for me, that's when you should start looking. I picture myself way back and running these FDA, test plans manually across these embedded devices and saying, I wish I could have a computer do this for me. That's definitely a key indicator that you could benefit from some CI.
Okay, so last question. What's the most interesting use case that Redfin has solved in GitLab CI?
I've got to say it's this fish bowls thing. So Redfin has this, fish water theme going on with its name. So we have this idea of the fish bowl, which is, it's like our own personal tugboat where we were actually able to run GitLab CI pipelines only for certain branches using rules that you can set up in your GitLab CI YAML. Say only run if the branch name matches, roughly this, and be able to go on our staging server, figure out what site to clone from for a database, for import the config automatically, really spin up a total environment with GitLab CI. And then what was extra cool was the ability to sort of hook into a very particular process in GitLab, which was like when I merge and delete the source branch, I want to destroy that environment off my staging site as well, my staging server as well. So that sort of like we, in a couple of weeks at Redfin, were able to sort of rebuild our own little tugboat for our environments because of, the automation that GitLab CI offered us and the hooks, matching the workflow we were using.
That's pretty cool. Yeah, and you touched on that with the adding the branch, stage dash to the branch name and being able to kind of spin up that environment. So that's pretty interesting. That's super cool. Well, Chris, thank you for joining us for the last 4 weeks. It's been a pleasure having you on.
I have, again, honored to be here. Always love talking with you all, and love talking about Drupal.
Yeah, thank you for being here. For our listeners, do you have questions or feedback? You can reach out to Talking Drupal on Twitter with the handle Talking Drupal, or via email at show@talkingdrupal.com. You can connect with our hosts and other listeners on Drupal Slack and the Talking Drupal channel. If you're interested in show news, upcoming Drupal camps, local meetups, Chad's Book Corner, then you can sign up for our newsletter at talkingdrupal.com/newsletter.
You can promote your Drupal community event on Talking Drupal. Learn more at talkingdrupal.com/TD promo.
And thank you, patrons, for supporting Talking Drupal. Your support is greatly appreciated. You can learn more about becoming a patron at talkingdrupal.com and choose Become a Patron. If you want to hear us talking about the new technology pre-show, that's how you can join.
So, Chris, if folks wanted to get a hold of you to talk about GitLab CI or Project Browser or Redfin or anything, how would they go about doing that?
Cool. Easiest way is any of the socials or Drupal Slack, Chris from Redfin and redfinsolutions.com.
Nick Laughlin, what about you?
You can find me pretty much everywhere online at Nixvan, NICXVAN.
And I'm John Picozzi. You can find me on all the major social networks and Drupal.org at John Picozzi. And you can find out about EPAM at EPAM.com.
And if you've all enjoyed listening, we've enjoyed talking.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good one.